You can start. Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour, bon dia, buenos dias. I hope you are safe and okay, everybody, and good Monday day in the morning. This is a new event organized also by the European Observatory on Memories, online event, and we are going to give the floor to the coordinator and Professor Anna Milosevic, who helped us to organize this conference about this spontaneous memorialization of terrorism. And I am happy and honored to welcome all the speakers and friends that we didn't see each other physically since a long time ago already. And also to say thank you to David, Noriol from home also, and Fernanda for your technical and dissemination support also, and the Open Society to help us to organize, and this, in the frame of this European Observatory Memories of the University of Barcelona, in this project that we are working together with many partners in Europe, and not only Europe, also Latin America and other issues around memory works and memory debates nowadays. This program of remembrance also at the European Commission called Europe for Citizens program. So today we are going to talk about this spontaneous memorialization of memorials that, for a shame, we are confronting already a long time ago. I remember myself that I was in 2013 in Richard Lenoir in Paris in my hotel room. There was this, this spontaneous memorial in this boulevard in Paris about these terrorist attacks, Charlie Hebdo. Also, we began in Barcelona with a new commissioner 5 years ago on democratic memory since our transitional period in Spain. And one of the first debates on the public space and the way to memorialize and memorialization in public space in Barcelona, it was this terrorist attack too. So this is spontaneous, these reflections we are dealing and with you, professors and experts all over Europe. We were with the IC Memo also in Utoya a long time ago. So these debates are quite new, but not new at all. And this year, of course, how to memorialize and reflection and from the European Observatory of Memories, we did a kind of a report for the city council, in that case in Barcelona, about this. Should Barcelona should have what kind of memorial and memorialization has to have about COVID-19, and this is how to deal with that when we are still in the I hope it's not in the middle, but in the quite end of the pandemic. So this is these reflections and more other reflections, not only of course in Spain, but other cities, other cases that you have been studied. We are so great to share with you. And Anna, please, I give you the floor to introduce also our friends and speakers. And I hope you that we are going to work very interesting topics and fields about. Thank you, Anna, for your cooperation and for your work. And thank to the other friends also.
Thank you, Jordi. I think David will also like to say something about our project.
Sure, I would like to do it. So thank you, Jordi. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, well, from our point of view as a project manager within this project, well, just to point out that this project is called Memorialization of Terrorist Attacks, a Policy Brief, which shows more or less what the aim of the project is. A project led by European Observatory on Memories and co-founded by the Open Society Foundations. I would like to say that from the very beginning of the idea, we just thought on Dr. Anna Milosevic to be in charge of it because, well, as you may already know, she's one of the main researchers on the field worldwide, and we are so pleased to work with her. And yeah, from the UROM, we would like to thank everyone involved in the project. Of course, Dr. Milosevic for carrying the work on research and dissemination and to lead the project. We would like to thank also the Open Society Foundations for trusting the project and acting as a generous co-founder. And of course, all the speakers involved in today's session, which kindly accept Dr. Milosevic's invitation to be part of it. A few remarks on the project. We could point that for us at Europe, it means a real challenge because usually in the memory studies field, we are used to analyze and reflect on how the present evokes the past and how past and present are constantly interconnected. But this project means something different. It means that we analyze this aftermath of those sites protagonists of terrorist attacks, and we think on how memory can help this process of mourning and how monuments and memorials can help in building a future of peace and coexistence. So in this case, we are not thinking more on how the past influences the present, but on the present as a tool for building a better future. And that is something of great value. And even though the scope of the project aims to analyze some specific cases, which are Utøya, Paris, and Barcelona, we can certainly think that these outputs that we are going to have within the frame of the project are going to be useful in broader contexts. The main output, by the way, as the project title shows, will be this policy brief, a set of recommendations to all agents involved, mainly public administrations, in the process of memorializing places where terrorist attacks had occurred, and that can serve as an action guide. And I would like to point also a second output that will be an online exhibition curated by Dr. Milosevic herself, which will be inspired on the research that she has been done already within these three cases shown, Utøya, Paris, and Barcelona, and that's I can guess, Anna, we will have it available from September on. So, and you can check it all out at the UROM site. And I think that's it. Thank again everyone involved in the project. Thank you again to everyone involved in this event. And now I give the floor to Anna.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Jordi, once again. So welcome everybody. Just a few words from me about the project as well, and about how this event is going to actually function. So first of all, I will moderate the session, and I would like to say a few words before introducing our speakers about the project itself and how this idea came into being. So what we really wanted to kind of assess with this project is not only the ways in which societies and individuals have responded to terrorist attacks, but also to see what are exactly memorial needs of the public in the immediate aftermath of the victims, in what way memorialization can assist societies and individuals in building some sort of resilience. So we wanted with this project to observe memorialization actually as some part of social and personal recovery after mass violence. And we think that this is particularly important and somehow I would say also neglected aspect of remembrance. You know, despite of, ascendance of the memory paradigm practically in all policy domains and its non-application to resilience building. So what we wanted to do with this project, what we are trying to do by looking at different cases, is to examine whether current memorialization policies are effective. So in order to do that, we want to provide a critical account of remembrance as a component of the healing process for the victims, for families, and the general public. So how are we going to do that, and how we are actually observing this kind of efficiency of the remembrance practices is that we are conducting a sort of needs assessment. So the basic idea is that, with the needs assessment is that you have a discrepancy between what is a current condition and what should or what is desirable condition. And that gap between what is and what it should be is really, I think, important in regard to addressing the underlying issue. what should be suggests that there is some kind of deficit, some underlying issue or problem to be addressed. So as some of your presentations will certainly highlight, sometimes when it comes to commemorating terrorist violence, we see this kind of discrepancy between the local, the national, the European level. We also see that there is some sort of discrepancy between what are the victims' needs in terms of memorialization, what are the needs of society, so to say, and how the institutions actually engage in memorialization. Sometimes this gap between what is and what it should be is really strong. It can lead to a protest, it can lead to a contestation. And what we also will show probably with all the presentations today is that the memorial needs of societies, of individuals, they shift over time. So without further ado, I would like to hear more from our distinguished speakers today, because we have really some of the leading experts in terms of memorialization, sociology of terrorism, and they, all of them have studied in depth a number of different cases from Europe and from around the world. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panel number one, that will deal specifically with public remembrance. And it will tackle this question of acceptance and also contestation of different forms of memorialization practices and tools that have been enacted since the immediate aftermath of terrorist attacks, to, let's say, also look at the long-term consequences and the ways in which these events of terrorist attacks have been transmitted to the society in terms of memorialization, museumization, archival work, etc., etc. So in the first panel, we have three distinguished speakers, and the first speaker is actually Dr. Konstantinos Arvanitis from the Manchester University, who is a senior lecturer in museology and also the director of the Institute for Cultural Practices at the University of Manchester. His research interests across the fields of museology, archaeology, cultural heritage, and digital media. And since 2017, Kostas has been working with the Manchester Art Gallery and a range of individuals and organizations in the United Kingdom and also internationally in researching these practices of collecting, archiving, and digitizing large-scale spontaneous memorials after terrorist attacks or other human-made or natural disasters. So Kostas has also led the formation of the International Network of Archives of Spontaneous Memorials, which is a really innovative network. And he brought together really, we can say, an international community, not only of researchers, but also of practitioners who work and practice in rapid response, emergency documentation, and long-term archiving of spontaneous memorials. So Kostas, thank you again for accepting to talk in today's mini conference. And we are really eager to hear from you about your own work and your views on the topic of our conference. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I will share my screen. Right, so it's really a pleasure to be here today and talk about our work at the University of Manchester on the role of spontaneous memorials collections in the memorialization of terror attacks. In this presentation, what I'd like to do is to focus on the formation of museum collections or archives of spontaneous memorials that spring up after terrorist attacks. There are various definitions of spontaneous memorials, and the one I'm using is one by Allen and all, a public response to the unanticipated, violent deaths of people who do not fit into the categories of those we expect to die, who may be engaged in routine activities in which there is a reasonable expectation of safety and with whom the participants in the ritual share some common identification. So such memorials, as already Anna has mentioned, have been the context of or object of different academic investigations. They range from studies on spontaneous memorials as spaces of cultural negotiation of public grief, studies on commemorative and performative roles that the memorials have as rituals of gift giving, as political protest and death rituals, as examples of mass mediation of disaster and tragic death, among other areas of research. However, spontaneous memorials raise also questions about the cultural professional practices and agents involved in turning them into museum collections. And such an examination is significant because of the value and roles that such collections have in creating material culture of the public's response to attacks, constructing personal and collective memories of tragic events, and challenging established archiving and museological methods and timeframes. And this is an example on the screen of an exhibit after on the first year anniversary of the Pulse shooting in Orlando in 2016. Now, in my own research, I've been investigating the conceptual, practical, and ethical challenges of managing, documenting, and archiving such collections. And this research has three main strands. I'm looking at museum practice of spontaneous memorials, who is involved in the decision-making about the formation of those, what is the public perception and participation in the construction and use of spontaneous memorials collections, and the broader policy and practice lessons one can learn from rapid documentation and the long-term archiving and use of those memorials. We're also looking at the therapeutic value of collections of spontaneous memorials, and this is work still in its beginning, both for people who have been affected physically and or emotionally by terrorist attacks, but for the broader community as well. And finally, we're looking at digital archives and collections of spontaneous memorials. The process of the digitization and how and whether the materiality of spontaneous memorials migrates into the digital. And that includes an analysis of social media on the kind of how memorials expand on kind of social and other digital media. And Anna has already mentioned a network, so I'm not going to focus on that. Now, in the rest of the presentation, what I'd like to focus on is the agency of museums in constructing what is in effect a material culture of the memory of the event. And in particular, I'd like to highlight that despite popular perceptions about museum collections being static and unchanging, the collections of spontaneous memorials can be dynamic and evolving. And although this applies to several cases, and I've been looking at the cases of Barcelona, Brussels, Paris, Stockholm, Orlando, and others, I will use the particular example of the Manchester Arena bombing today. So a bit about the event, the attack. On the 22nd of May, 2017, a homemade bomb was detonated as people were leaving the Ariana Grande concert at the Manchester Arena. 23 people, including the bomber, were killed and over 700 were injured. Within hours of the attack, the people of Manchester started leaving flowers, candles, soft toys, balloons, written notes, and other items in various locations in the city, with the focus being the St. Anne's Square that you see on the screen. And these memorials grew quickly, with the focus being, as I said, this square. More than 10,000 items have been kept at the Manchester Art Gallery to form an archive of the public response to the Manchester Arena attack, what is now known as the Manchester Together Archive. I'd like to draw on this case in order to reflect on its capacity to continue enacting the spontaneous memorials characteristics as a performative, responsive, and public process of heritage making. And I'd like to present 3 instances of public participation in its formation, which turned the archive into an active, collective, and open space for a heritage of memory. And accordingly, I'd like to argue that the Manchester Together archive is not just a collection or a representation of the spontaneous memorial, but another form and manifestation of the memorial itself. So the first instance of public participation has to do with the formation of the spontaneous memorial itself. Let me explain. On Saturday, the 10th of June, 2017, one day after the clearance of St. Anne's Square, a small number of people, led by the then acting director of the Manchester Art Gallery, went to an abandoned fire station in Manchester, where all the material was taken the night before. The task on the day was to select a number of representative items which would be kept and sent for conservation, while the rest would be disposed of. On the day, though, it became clear very quickly that the team did not have any solid criteria of selecting what items to keep and what not to. So the decision was made to keep everything, at least at that stage. Reflecting on the decision to keep rather than proceed to apply collecting criteria, as it has happened in other cases, the acting director of the gallery said, "We started to understand that the material was essentially a single memorial with thousands of constituent parts, from notes written on scraps of paper and thousands of cards and letters, to poems, pictures, soft toys, school art projects, football shirts, and personal tributes. It was all important, and we felt that the decision on what should be kept and what shouldn't would have been arbitrary and detrimental to the meaning and importance of the memorial." So the decision to keep everything infused the process of museum collecting with what Marita Sturken calls cultural reenactment of trauma. Sturken approaches the repetition of the 9/11 images, such as the Twin Towers or the photo of a firefighter holding a dead child in tourist souvenirs, as a constant reenactment of the 9/11 images, a cultural reenactment of trauma, as he calls it. She says repetition is a means through which cultures process and make sense of traumatic events. It is caught up in kitsch and the relentless recording of trauma into popular cultural narratives. Yet it is also evidence of the ways that cultures reenact, sometimes compulsively, moments of traumatic change. So in a similar fashion, the repeated leaving of items in St. Anne's Square, most of which were either similar or the same, such as flowers or soft toys and t-shirts, was a form of cultural reenactment too, a way to make sense of what happened through the repetitive and participatory form of spontaneous memorialization. So in this sense, when the director calls the 10,000 items of St. Anne's Square a single memorial, or when she stresses that selecting a sample of them to keep would have been detrimental to the meaning and importance of the memorial, she approaches the act and content of the spontaneous memorial as a cultural reenactment of trauma. By extension, a selective and representative collection of, say, 100 items rather than 10,000 items would have ignored the prescribed emotional content of each of the items deposited in St. Anne's Square. In contrast, keeping everything constructed the archive as a record of the way this repetition and use of everyday objects worked as both an individual and collective process of making sense of the event. In this sense, the archive is not just a collection or the materiality of the spontaneous memorial, but of people's embodied and performative participation in them, their cultural reenactment of trauma. So the point I'm making here is that by rejecting standard collecting practices and embracing completeness, the gallery approached the spontaneous memorial as a mass participation event that needed to be preserved as such. The archive then is a physical manifestation and embodiment of both the individual and collective participation in the spontaneous memorial. The second instance of public participation I'd like to mention has to do with what happened to the 10,000 soft toys retrieved from St. Anne's Square, These were washed by members of the Women's Institute and then donated to charities. And I'd like to play a short video that tells this story now.
I turned up at the sports hall where I'd been told to go and collect the teddy bears. Mum and we kept back our kind of quota. The next step is obviously to wash the bears and just generally taking care of them.
So I'll take this off because it's red.
Yes, and we don't want that
pink.
cream bear culling
Yeah,
up some
so
funny
I'll do
pink
that.
colour. We wanted to make sure that we didn't, kind of end up hurting or damaging the bears because of the very nature of where the bears have come from and why we are looking after them.
It's so important because people came to make some kind of gesture. And so out of respect for them and out of respect for all the people, we want to save all these soft toys. They're a bit dirty. You wash them, you prepare them, get them ready to hand on. And some child somewhere can get some
Get the benefit,
comfort
yeah.
and some pleasure from them. Lovely things. That's really nice. To save what they can of it. I think they have done the right thing. It was put there for a reason. It's disrespectful to everybody to just clear it all away as if, well, that's over, we're moving on. Like the IRA bomb, it's embedded in Manchester's history. This is embedded in Manchester's history.
Doing this was just the right thing to do. So we just got on and did it, didn't we? Yeah.
I'll come back to that in a moment. The third example I'd like to mention is what happened at the first year anniversary when about half of the families of the people who were killed came to see the archive. Clark and Franzman note that there is material evidence at the memorial sites that communication with the deceased takes place and that the deceased is believed to be present in some way and capable of receiving the communication. This was also witnessed during the family visits to the archive. Family members kept looking for evidence, mentions, or other evidence of their loved ones in the material of the archive, opening drawers and spending time to read some of the 7.5 thousand written notes. And were then invited to take items away, such as this lantern with the Manchester bee design, dry flowers, or a yellow soft toy, because yellow was the favorite color of one of the girls who lost their lives. Actions such as the above of removing items from the museum fall under the broader developments in ethical deaccessioning in museum studies. But here I'm arguing that the washing of the soft toys that we've just watched or the passing on of memorial items are not simply part of a museum's ethical disposal approach, but the memorial performance itself. It enabled the archive to continue undergoing an active process of change and transformation. This then offers a perspective of the role of museums as memory spaces that are driven by a focus on process rather than permanence. And in this sense, the archive functions as an ever active and changing memorial. So to conclude, the above examples demonstrate, I think, that collections of spontaneous memorials are products of institutional, cultural, professional, and personal agencies. Also, such collections should not necessarily be considered static and unchanging, but dynamic and evolving. And the collections, like the spontaneous memorials themselves, are a performative and public process of heritage making. And this breaks any notion of linear time between the memorials and their archives by blurring the boundaries between the two. In this sense, the archive, as I said, functions as an ever active and evolving memorial. And this, of course, raises all sorts of questions about ownership, authorization, and authority, which I don't have time to talk about today, but are questions that we are considering in the context of this research. Participatory culture literature calls for participatory archives that are not simply about allowing users to contribute to a framework where ultimate control lies in the archivist, but are also about enabling a more radical user participation in the actual management. So the Manchester Together Archive will go on exploring opportunities for such participation so that the archive can be an active, changing, collective, open, and both a personal and a social space for a heritage of memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas. And really, thank you for these important insights, especially on the Manchester Together Archive and the ways that the event is actually memorialized through heritage making. I think that also in conversation with Dr. Gensberger's presentation later on, but also with the research I did on the Brussels archives, we can make some really interesting connections and conclusions because this kind of comparative perspective kind of also is still lagging in the research. So I look forward to taking the questions on Dr. Arvanitis' presentation from the audience. But first of all, I would like to introduce our next speaker. So the questions from the audience will be addressed after all three speakers in the first panel have presented their work. So the next speaker is Robert Simpson, also from the Manchester University, who is, Robert, correct me, you are a PhD student.
That's right, yeah.
Yes, who's doing very important research that examines some of the questions that we are tackling today, especially the notions of social solidarity and community resilience following public atrocities such as the terrorist attacks. So what Robert is actually looking at, what is questioning is why and how spontaneous memorials occur. So what exactly drives participants to physically go to the sites of atrocities in an act of commemoration? And I look forward to his presentation today and learning more about what are his current findings about this process, and especially in relation to the Manchester attacks. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you to everyone who's listening via YouTube as well. I'm just going to try and put my screen on, hopefully.
Through share screen?
Yeah, so hopefully this should work. Anna, can you see that? Brilliant.
Yes.
Excellent. So obviously, as you may have guessed, my PhD research works very closely with a lot of what Kostas has just been talking through. So most of this will be a follow on. I was quite pleased, actually, some of the pictures I took out of this PowerPoint, I noticed Kostas had them in his, so there's been no overlap, hopefully. I've given the broad title for this is Multimodal Meanings Behind Spontaneous Memorials. And what I'm going to be doing today is just talking through what that means, and particularly what is meant by an object-based approach to spontaneous memorials. As Anna said, my name's Robert Simpson. I'm currently a second-year PhD student at the University of Manchester. And as Anna's also said, I'm just here to very briefly introduce some of the methods that I currently use to explore why and how people take part in spontaneous memorials. I'm also a part of the Manchester Together Archive, and that means that I work in close collaboration with the art gallery, and we saw pictures of that earlier. And again, I'm focusing on the 10,000 items that were left at St Anne's Square, including the 7,500 written notes, messages that were left. And obviously this is all following the Manchester Arena attack on the 22nd of May 2017. I suppose the quickest way to describe my own research is to say that I'm interested in the social and cultural practice of meaning making at spontaneous memorials, and in particular how objects that people leave such sites can continue to be received, interpreted and understood in their post-memorial museum settings. And I think I was something that I hadn't really focused on too much here, but building on what Kostas said about the gallery itself and the archive not being static, that, you know, it's still very much a part of the process of memorialization. And I do strongly believe that it's still part of that cathartic process as well. This is post-trauma, and the effects of that trauma is still very much felt in Manchester and beyond. So the primary focus of my work examines notions of togetherness, solidarity, and community resilience following public atrocities, and in particular how groups and communities express individual and shared feelings through acts of makeshift commemoration. I would describe my approach first and foremost, particularly the last year's worth of research, is very hands-on and interactive. Obviously in recent months, because of the pandemic, that's presented some challenges. But what I've generally found is that such levels of immersive contact have led towards greater freedoms. And by allowing myself prolonged periods of time to interact with and handle memorial objects, it's allowed me to be able to consider a broader range of methodologies. Through this approach, I blend theoretical and methodological perspectives from material cultural studies and social semiotics, chiefly multimodal discourse analysis. I've taken this approach because of its ability to offer a range of investigative freedom in tilting and shifting the focus between different modes of meaning making. Such freedoms have allowed me to approach the items that are housed in the archive, firstly as objects, as tangible material evidence of the cultural values, customs, and influences of the community responding to a terror attack. And through this view, I argue that these objects convey meaning in multi-layered, or rather multimodal ways, by drawing on a range of what social semioticians would call semiotic resources. These semiotic resources are best described as the tools made available to create and communicate meaning in context. And such tools include aspects, as we've seen in some of the pictures, such as the materials that are used to create these objects, the overall design and the process of construction, or it could be the language, so the words and the messages themselves, their semantic design, how they were arranged, organized, and presented. It could be visual content, so it could be the images, drawings, sketches, and it could be motivated signs. So we're thinking about things like icons, signs, symbols, or color to communicate meaning. I unfortunately can't dwell on this too much, and it was in this talk, but I've had to remove it for time limitations. But we've seen this kind of thing before, and one of the things I'll focus on is the prevalence and popularity of the Manchester worker bee symbol at Manchester. And in my, I'm going to call it an extended version of this, I make connections to the Peace for Paris symbol as well, and the way that that became so prevalent and popular after the Paris attacks. So I think it is something that is playing into pre-existing cultural responses to memorialization. You know, these memorials and the people that take part of them are learning from each other, and they're building on top of other people's experiences. And I think that's important, particularly in the context of this conference, thinking about European memory and thinking about terrorism and thinking about public memorialization. Collectively, all of these different modes of meaning making intersect with one another to bring together meanings made whole. And I always kind of like to see it as a fusion of multi-layered semiotic resources, all designed to work together for a single purpose. So today, I'm just going to spend a few moments explaining how my object-based multimodal approach to memorial objects has helped me to gain crucial insight into the cultural meanings behind why people take part in spontaneous memorials, and how through this mixed method approach, I'm able to gather unique data about these different layers of semiotic resources and how they're used to communicate public feeling. And the long-term view of this is for the gallery, for museums and archives and practitioners and researchers to understand more intimately the process that people go through when they are commemorating and memorializing tragedy in public. The Manchester Together archive, again, it's building on what Kostas was saying, now stands primarily as a collection of objects, where the first point of engagement is an interactive, tactile, and material one. These objects, items, the notes, the messages, continue to exist in a post-memorial museum setting and signify a physical reminder of the performance of public grief as artifactual evidence of a community's response to public atrocity. Such responses, I argue, indicate a social agreement to quantify shared feelings in material ways in order to incite social action and recovery, that the enactment of collectivized mourning needs to be made visible, made palpable, in order to be publicly acknowledged and understood. It could be argued, therefore, that spontaneous memorials are places where people can congregate to mark their involvement and participation in material ways, as a way to reconstruct their sense of security and hope for the future, and to feel more socially supported and united. It is for these reasons that I believe that the physical presence and the materiality of the collection at the Manchester Together Archive cannot be ignored. That individually and collectively, these objects continue to mean something. They tell a story, each of those items adding further coherence to the narrative of the memorial. In recent months, I have focused much of my attention on two groups of objects housed in the archive. They are painted pebbles and textile hearts. Painted pebbles and textile hearts collectively make up a large section of the memorial. What's quite interesting about these particular ones, in particular the pebbles, is that at some point during the memorial, people were actually invited to take these items away. And it seems to play into the pre-existing trend of pebble art or geocaching, where you paint and decorate a rock and hide it for someone to find, and the finder takes it and moves it, and it continues. And I think that's quite an interesting thing that I'm not going to focus on too much here, but the idea of continuing bonds, but also this sense of finding and searching for things, and that sense of searching for meaning. Pebbles and textile hearts, my interest in these two objects is twofold. Firstly, because the origin, prominence, and eventual popularity of both groups of objects can be traced back to grassroots online trends and campaigns. This was a factor that allowed me to further develop my ideas about the different forms of influences that direct and shape behavior at spontaneous memorials. Secondly, I found myself deeply interested in the way that mourners tend to construct these objects and how they draw on this idea of blending semiotic resources to communicate their feelings and responses to tragedy. So far, I have found that these groups of objects often reveal that these layers of meaning, their range of semiotic resources, are intended to function in agreement with one another, that there is intent and signification in the design of these objects. Because of this, I feel that painted pebbles and textile hearts are themselves representative of the nature of spontaneous memorials, in that these separate individual semiotic resources, much like the individual people who make up a memorial, operate collectively to multimodally strengthen their meanings. It seems important to note how inventive and artistic these groups of objects are. And I think the same can be said for many of the objects that are housed in the archive, and not just in Manchester, across the world and across Europe, particularly. People engage creatively with the process of public memorialization. And I think that's an important factor for museums and archives and practitioners to remember. It is apparent that both time and thought has been invested in the making of these items, and that as memorial objects, these items demand a certain level of creative skill. And in a lot of cases, that's a creative embodied engagement. So it can be painting or designing, or in some cases, as we see in the Manchester memorials, it can be technical skills such as knitting or crocheting or sewing. Given that such creative endeavors require a level of planning, preparation, and focused attention, it can be assumed that as a conscious decision is made to invest time in the process of creation, and that the time set aside to prepare and create the object is perceived as both worthwhile and meaningful. And in this sense, it would appear that creative work, as Eliot 1999 remarks, can be understood as integral to the process of mourning, that creative expressions can act as a therapeutic tool for conceptualizing trauma and loss. From small, delicately painted flowers, apologies for that. Sorry, we'll get rid of that. From small, delicately painted flowers, butterflies, and love hearts that frequently accompany messages of condolence, to the intricate and carefully composed images of worker bees, as we can see in the images on the slide. These images are used to convey messages of community strength and togetherness. The construction and design of many of these objects appear far from incidental. There we go. This object, for example, represents an interesting and creative combination of semiotic resources, which appear to communicate messages of love and support, alongside messages of strength and resilience. This is conveyed firstly through the design choice. So as you can see, there is the shape of a love heart, but also the attribution to the online campaign, which was popularized through the hashtag A Heart for Manchester. In addition, the use of colors, black and yellow, tie together the pre-existing cultural meanings behind the Manchester worker bee with messages of unity and strength. Reinforcing this further, the creator also includes a number of small decorative buttons which can be seen around the center of the design. These are stitched firmly into the fabric, and one of the attachments in particular depicts a small worker bee, which, like the heart shape of the design itself, provides a more obvious visual reference point for the intended meaning. This particular attachment not only plays into the motif of resilience, but seeks to consolidate the intended conveyance of meaning by essentially communicating the same idea twice. This idea is first communicated through color. The design consists of sheets of black and yellow felt fabric, which are crafted into heart shapes before being stitched together. Through this process, the potential message is that there is strength in love, which is communicated through the shape of the object, and that this love is made stronger through the act of coming together, that this layering and stitching of heart-shaped sheets of fabric. This idea is then strengthened further still by the small worker bee button, which itself is also stitched firmly into the layers of hearts to suggest that strength and resilience goes hand in hand with community togetherness and support. By drawing all of these design choices together, my argument is that the creation of this object in the creation of this object, there exists a conscientious design choice to strengthen the coherence of meaning through the multi-layering of colors, signs, symbols, and materials, and that through this process of creation, this object intended to vocalize and convey multiple messages through the use of culturally identifiable imagery. Another example is, bear with me again. There we go. Sorry. As I've already suggested, for both painted pebbles and textile hearts, there appears to be a significant correlation between the expression of resilience and strength and the base materials used to communicate and transfer meaning. That in many instances, the drive to reconstruct and transmit meanings in the wake of public atrocity is as palpable and salient in the earliest design choices as they are in other modes of meaning making, such as written language or color or imagery. In this sense, one of the earliest design choices is concerned with selecting the medium to convey the message. So a participant might choose stone or yarn or twine or wood. This selection process can be viewed as an acknowledgement by the creator of the modal affordances and suitability of certain materials over others. Rock and stone, for instance, has a long history in mourning practices and rituals, so it's arguably preloaded with the means to fit the requirements of a mourning object, from official monuments, gravestones and tombs, to stone mounds, cairns, and decorative pebbles. The constancy and resistance of memorial stone can compensate for the immateriality and absence of the deceased. Stone is a widely available, tough and resistant material. It can withstand exposure and pressure from the elements, making it ideal for outdoor public memorials. And unlike some materials found at spontaneous memorials, stone assumes a certain degree of perpetuity and durability, which can be linked both to the material remains of the dead, as well as the persistence of memory and continuing bonds. Where objects of ephemerality, such as flowers and votive candles, may stand as an acknowledgement of the fragility and temporariness of life, the more enduring items, such as rock and painted pebbles, may acknowledge the strength and endurance of attachment, beliefs, and obligations in the wake of absence. It's interesting to observe how frequently sentiments such as strength and resilience are depicted in the design choices of memorial pebbles. The creators who engage with rock and stone as an object appear to recognize the relevance and symbolism of its material strength by continuing the theme of resilience in the design, language, and imagery used to convey their message. For example, there are two stones that exemplify the intersection between material relevance as a symbol of strength and written language as an expression of togetherness. Both of the objects that you see on the screen are similar in appearance. They're both palm-sized, flattish, dark-coloured pebbles. One is painted using the colours of the Union Jack flag, which is the one on the left, but it's on the other side, so you can't see it from here. And the colours of the Union Jack flag appear probably about as equally as the colours of the Manchester worker bee. And in my research, I'm currently looking at how this articulates national solidarity and patriotism, but also potentially divisiveness as well. And that's something that's an ongoing project. But within the white circle, which covers the bulk of the surface of this pebble, there is also a painted black and yellow Manchester worker bee. And beneath reads a message that says, "I love Manchester, I heart Manchester," written in pink ink, and it depicts an ideogrammatic red love heart. The back of this item, the side that we're looking at now, there is a message that reads, "To our 22 Manchester angels, let your love guide us to stay strong. This is our Manchester." Now, through this object, the creator positions the notion of love and remembrance as paramount in the process of nurturing resilience, that love possesses the power to guide and strengthen the grieving community. Moreover, the use of plurality and possession in the language conveyed through the pronoun us and the determiner our invites inclusivity and shared ownership, that in the wake of loss, collective strength and togetherness can aid the process of healing. Both objects from this sample represent the material relevance of rock as a means of conveying collective unity and strength, where the choice to use rock as the base material could be viewed as a conscious act to reinforce the message of resilience. Thus, like the previous example, the second object here also combines the hardness of stone with the sense of community togetherness and resilience. The message, which simply reads, "Unity is strength," likewise relates to an acknowledgement of the material relevance of rock and stone as a communicative tool in public mourning practices. That the sentiments expressed here not only coalesce with the relevance of the base material as a symbol of permanence and endurance, but serve to bolster the strength of community through the act of assembling, of coming together to stand firm against terrorism. A similar argument can also be made about the materiality of textile hearts, and this is the last example that I'll give, particularly those that are knitted and crocheted. As a form of creative expression in mourning, both knitting and crocheting can be understood as a symbolic act of unity and strength, insofar as both crafts revolve around the process of interlacing and weaving materials together in a systematic and ordered way. Each of the examples that you see on the screen here are carefully constructed to produce a finish that is both aesthetically pleasing and meaningful. And like many of the objects housed in the Manchester Together archive, these particular examples also include some form of additional design feature or attachment, potentially as a way to contribute or to consolidate to the object's overall meanings, whether this equates to an intricately crocheted rose to further convey love and support, or a badge depicting a hand-stitched image of a worker bee to vocalize resilience. It could also be, as we see in all of these examples, a ribbon designed to display the object as a public declaration of support and solidarity. The observation made is that the production of meaning is almost always multi-layered, indeed multimodal by intent. So in conclusion, I know it's got a lot of information to cram into 10 minutes. But in conclusion, it could be argued that the people who contribute to spontaneous memorials by constructing objects like the ones mentioned here do so in the knowledge that meaning is made more meaningful, palpable, and concrete when their intentions, their purpose and objective is made more communicable and comprehensible. In other words, we could assert that on some level, the individual creators of these painted pebbles and textile hearts exhibited a conscious awareness of the multimodal potential of their objects, and that the layering of different semiotic resources is an intentional factor in the process of communicating both personal and shared views. So my take-home message is that this mixed method approach, particularly the hands-on interactive style of research, can offer greater opportunities to understand more intimately the different layers of meanings produced through these memorial objects, and to acknowledge the level of creative and therapeutic engagement that people employ in the creation of these objects. Admittedly, this approach can be a fairly slow process, and it's one that must adopt a depth of analysis over breadth of analysis mindset. Yet I believe that studying more closely the materiality of these multimodal objects can create new ways of thinking about social relevances around spontaneous memorials, more importantly, the people who create them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Robert. My compliments, because your research seems not only very relevant, but also very, very interesting. And I look forward to learning more over the years about your research and what are going to be your conclusions, and hopefully in some kind of a written form, whether it's going to be a book or a thesis. I really look forward to reading your final results.
Thank you.
We have some questions coming from the audience, but first of all, let's welcome Charlotte Heed-Kelly. That doesn't need special kind of introduction, because whoever works with the topic of memorialization and terrorism has probably read her book, Debt and Security, Memory and Mortality at the Bomb Site. So Dr. Charlotte Heed-Kelly, she's a reader in international security and at the University of Warwick. And currently she holds a European Research Council grant to study the expansion of countering violent extremism policies in Europe. So this project is going to last for a couple of more years. And today she will talk about when does terrorism memorialization actually can lead to a protest. So she's gonna walk us through some of the controversies using the cases from Norway, Spain, and the UK. So Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. It's really nice to get away from my other projects for a while and to not have to think about countering violent extremism, but instead to come back to memory research. So I do really appreciate being invited and hearing the excellent presentations of the others.
Charlotte, sorry, excuse me, can you just put the camera on, please?
It is on my end.
It is on? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, we see.
Yeah, okay.
Is that good?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So as you see, tech is not my forte. So I'm not going to have a PowerPoint presentation because it just invites trouble for me. So I'm just going to tell you about when memorialization can lead to protest. I work in a politics department, so this is very much focused on the national level competitions and processes that follow terrorist attacks to build a large public architecture, often with a museum attached. So this is the other end of the spectrum to sort of an individual's decision to lay down flowers and spontaneously memorialize. This is the national end of the spectrum and the real complications with those processes for decision makers and states. So from 2016 to about 2019, I was working on a large kind of study of cases of national memorialization of terrorist attacks across Indonesia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Spain. It kept me very busy. It was a very interesting project. Centrally, the research question looked at all of these states have a similar problem. They need to respond to an atrocity. They need to try and build resilience through architecture in the ways that are expected of them, in the ways that other states have been doing. And my central question was looking at why this backfires more frequently than you would think. That, you know, this is one of the nicer things a state can do, right? To try and dedicate space, commemoration, and architecture to help its people recover from something terrible that's happened. This is one of the nicer aspects of governance. This is not war. This is not counterterrorism policy. This is supposed to be soft and easy, you'd think, but it's not. It's incredibly complex and it goes wrong. So my project was looking into that complexity and how it can backfire. So when does terrorism memorialization lead to protest? Now, the most significant cases of protest were not the European ones in the study. Outside Europe, it was the protests or the dissatisfaction with memorials could be far stronger, could lead to demonstrations on the streets. The most significant case in the book is it's about the reconstruction of the 9/11 site in Manhattan in particular, where the towers fell. And I realized looking back on it that my research at the time was probably with the people who became paramount in the QAnon movement, you know, the conspiracy theorists currently at large in the United States. Back in the day, they used to call themselves the Tea Party. Now, when the memorialization competitions were running for what are we going to build on this site? How are we going to reconstruct this World Trade Center site? This movement basically started a huge conspiracy that a giant 13-story mosque was going to be built on the site of the World Trade Center. Absolutely, fundamentally untrue. And yet, this became a huge social movement of protest. Many people came to New York to protest, thinking that this is what was going to happen, that the liberal elite in New York was going to build a mosque on the site. A rather extreme example, but it kind of points to how destroyed space or the site of trauma, even if there isn't too much physical infrastructure damage, will take on the political dynamics of a society around it. And any conflicts that are ongoing in society will often then focus themselves through that site and will play out through that site, which is fascinating for me to see that happening. It's largely kind of unexplained why that happens, but it keeps happening. So we need to talk about Europe, though, because the event is focused on Europe. In the book and the kind of articles around the book, there's sort of two large themes that draw from the case studies, particularly in the US and Indonesia, but also Norway, Spain, and the UK. And there's two themes that understand how protest plays through after memorialization or during memorialization. The first theme to hold in your head when I tell the stories is that there's a history of design change in memorialization, particularly large physical memorialization done by states. And that is, there's been a move away from statues that depict scenes or people, what we would call figurative depiction. And there's been a move away from that towards non-figurative architecture. This is your kind of abstract art, your black marble representation of horror, rather than a statue, rather than an actual depiction of something that has happened. So that's one design trend to hold in your head when I tell the story. James Young's work on this is excellent. Secondly, as a consequence of this long history of design change, a new commitment has evolved in the memorialization of disasters, which designers call site authenticity. Now, what this means is that when they're planning how to memorialize an atrocity or a disaster, they are very keen to use the authenticity of the site to help communicate the horror of what happened, the lessons that society needs to learn from this, and also the commemoration that is aimed towards the families who have lost their loved ones. So the site itself becomes very, very important and very resonant to remake it, to communicate these healing functions rather than to stay as it is, which can be quite disturbing and damaged. These two things come together and they play off each other. So abstract design, site authenticity, they play off each other. And if the dynamic backfires in certain ways, we see it lead to protest. Now, this will sound quite abstract. Let me run you through how this plays out. The most, probably the most important case study in Europe for the project was the Norwegian case study. So I'm not going to use the name. I'm going to call him the perpetrator. Well, the perpetrator basically parked a truck bomb under the Oslo government building, killing many people. But then he drove to Utøya Island, which is about 45 minutes away from Oslo. And then he executed a large number of teenagers and children. How does memorialization play out? The Norwegian case is absolutely fascinating in that it's one of the very few cases I'm aware of where the entire national memorial competition was held, a winner was found, the designs were set up, the money was provided, they were about to start work on this, but the protest against the memorial that was chosen was so intense that the whole process ended up being cancelled after a lawsuit and had to go back to the beginning and start again. How on earth did this happen? Particularly, it happened because of the relevance of abstract design, but also site authenticity and not being able to use the actual site where the atrocity happened. This happened twice in the Norwegian case. First of all, the plan was, how do we memorialize in Oslo? The government site is the government site. We need to use that for government function. Where are we going to put a memorial to this atrocity? The decision was made to use the Castle Park, which is about 1.5 kilometers away. This was the original plan. It makes sense in the history of memorialization, but it doesn't make sense if the site has to be used and the site is expected by people to be used and resolved through design. So almost immediately, the residents of Oslo and the social movements of the victims' organizations were questioning, what on earth does Castle Park have to do with the bombing of the government quarter? They're not the same area. Why would we have a memorial that's 1.5 kilometers away? The point was accepted, and the memorial plan underwent its first change and was changed so that it would occur at the government quarter. Anyone who knows the story will know that this doesn't go well. That the new plan involves bringing down a very key high-rise tower, again, without public consultation, and again, sparks massive protest because the building is now very important in the social imaginary. It has survived the attack. Norwegian society is traumatized after what has happened. The building has survived, even though it's badly damaged. It becomes an important symbol of recovery. So the plan to demolish it to make way for a new government quarter with a memorial is not accepted. And that is still playing out to this day, a decade later. This also happens with the Utøya Island site, so 45 minutes away, where most of the killing occurred. Key to understanding why the memorial was completely cancelled and had to be restarted is that the site could not be obtained by the government. The site is privately owned by the Labour Youth Group. They have built their own memorial for the families there. But the state still wants to build its own national memorial at the site. It still wants to facilitate the role of healing. It can't just back off and leave it to the Labour Youth to do with the families. It needs to play a role. So they pick a site across the water from the island. I've done several series of field work out there, and originally talking to the jurors on the design committee, they were so excited because they'd found the most perfect design that was going to encapsulate the horror of that day and what had happened, and was really going to embed it in an architectural design. And that design is called Memory Wound, if you remember it. It is the gash that is cut through a peninsula, and the visitors to the memorial are confronted with this gash. They walk up to this gash in the earth, and the names are written on the other side, and they cannot reach them, they cannot touch them. The trauma is inaccessible. So it is absolutely the most, quite stark, but also beautiful representation of trauma. Now, this will never be built, even though it won the competition, was ready to be funded, the contracts were signed. It was never built because there was a lack of consultation, number one, but also it's an abstract design that occurs at a significant distance from the site. There is no actual site authenticity going on there. There's no relationship physically to what happened. It is across the water in a different place. All of this contributed to a large movement of people against the design, particularly the local residents who'd been told to expect that the major memorial would be in Oslo, nowhere near them, and that a small satellite site would be located near them. When the jurors picked an abstract design of that magnitude, of that volume, that was not going to be on the island itself where it would be physically relevant, the local community panicked. They worry very much that buses of people will come up to dark tourism kind of inspired visits to the memorial and disrupt their peace. Also, it needs to be noted that these people were involved in the recovery. They went out in boats under gunfire to pick the children out of the water. So these are people who, they're not just angry local residents, they are recovery workers, they are traumatized. Their voices need to be heard. They're often spoken about as kind of in demeaning ways by the city residents. You know, these locals who have this different politics, they don't understand the design. You can imagine how they're spoken about and the politics that plays out, which is somewhat unfair. So they went to court, stating that this is not what we were told. Also, this design is far too stark and not on a relevant piece of ground related to the attack, and they won. And the whole design process has been cancelled because in the end, the state backed down. They didn't want to drag the victims' families into a court case about this. So the state has backed down and there will be a different plan. But many, many years on, no resolution. It's probably the most significant European case for a memorial backfiring that hasn't even been built. I got maybe like 1 minute left, so I'll say something about the UK. The 2005 bombings in the UK, there were 3 tube bombings and 1 bus bombing. How do you memorialize something that happens underground? How do you build as a state an object of architecture that will create healing and resolve trauma if most of the attack site was invisible and underground? How are you going to respond to that as an artist applying to the competition to try and do this? There was a compromise solution in effect. Because most of the attacks happened underground, the decision was taken to put an abstract memorial, 52 pillars of steel, in Hyde Park. So it's not near really any of the attack sites, but it's in the main public green area of the city. The families have been involved throughout, very, very closely with every stage of the planning of the design. So the families themselves are satisfied that they've been involved. There's been no dissatisfaction voiced by the families about the memorial. So in one regard, it's a very successful memorial. It has done its job to an extent. However, it's completely spatially disconnected from most of the bomb sites, all of the bomb sites. And this has led to a process whereby local residents of the bus bomb have said, there's nothing here to mark what happened. There's an abstract design, but it's completely physically separate from the site where this happened. And they want something authentic to the site. So there's been a separate memorial that's been funded by local philanthropists in the area, and also the stagecoach owner of the buses and bus company affected. So in response to this national memorial that kind of works, there's been a rather polite dissatisfaction that says, yeah, but you haven't addressed what happened here in this square where the bus exploded and the people died. And a whole new memorial has been organized to kind of counterbalance and fix that dynamic. So there's no protest in a sense. This is really the polite end of the spectrum. But in a way, it speaks to that importance of what happens when we have abstract design, because we can't figuratively represent what's happened, and what happens when we need to use abstract design but can't use the site itself. All kinds of design tensions come up, cannot resolve the different communities. You need different things from the site and the memorial, and this can lead to protest in the US case, cancellation in the Norwegian case, and a whole separate process for a new memorial in the UK case. And I'll stop there because we're running out of time.
All right, thank you, Charlotte, for this very interesting presentation. So I would like all three speakers now to put on their cameras and mics on, because we have around 10 minutes for a short discussion about your presentations. And the questions are, some of the questions are coming from the public as well, from the audience, asking mainly how comparative these cases are. So what can we learn from, on a global scale, from comparing these kind of different experiences that you talked about?
I can mention the depth or value of comparison here when it comes to museum practices. I think what is interesting in the formation of collections or archives of spontaneous memorials, if one looks at a broad range of examples over the last 20 years, from the 1995 Oklahoma bombings and onwards, is that one sees a variety of practices involved, which is actually quite interesting, because in many ways every single city responded slightly differently to the question: how do we preserve, how do we maintain and create a record, an archive of items of spontaneous memorials? There are some cases, like in Orlando, they on day one, right from the start, they created a collecting policy. They decided what to collect based on institutional collecting, and that's what museums do. They have policies about what to collect and what not to collect. So they created a policy based on their broader institutional policy, and that was the guide. In Barcelona or in Manchester, it was a different approach. Barcelona, everything was collected from the La Rambla. The same goes with Manchester. So it's what I find here very, very interesting is that every city drew on its own and the professionals drew on their own sense of professional ethics, but also civic responsibility to come up with a solution that is right for the city itself from their point of view. What I think is also very interesting is that despite the number of terrorist attacks and archives of spontaneous memorials after terrorist attacks over the last 20 or 25 years, we don't see like a standardization of this kind of creating collections. There is no migration or learning from one side to another. I think Robert kind of made a very good point that the public knows how to behave, almost because they see it in the media and so on. And professionals learn from each other. But because museums are all about regularity and frequency and things that happen again and again and again. There is one attack in Manchester. Hopefully we won't have another one in the future. So the learning does not become institutional memory, so to speak, and it doesn't also migrate to other cases. I think this is partly what we're trying to do with the international network, not to standardize the process, but to understand how different cases make different decisions, and so that we can also advise others in the future. So there is some kind of level of comparison here, but I don't think there is uniformity.
Robert, do you want to pick up
Yeah, I mean, I was really taken by quite a few of the points that were raised in the last talk as well. And I think one of the issues that I've certainly picked up on quite a lot in my research is that when the public informally gather and construct something, whether that is a memorial or individual items, and they leave it, for me, I think it's that process and that embodied experience of construction that carries quite a lot of the meaning. And I think one of the biggest tensions, and you see this in numerous events and cases, is when that sense of construction is then seemingly deconstructed by, say, a formal organization, a government, or an archive or a council. And one of the things that I've been writing about fairly recently is the tension behind the Wall of Pain in Croatia, and particularly that sense of constructing something that is very people-led and is very emotive and is very poignant. And then where those tensions arise when something is deconstructed. And I think again, I know it's easy for me to say this from the UK years later, but I think one of the problems of the Croatian government in particular exercise there was that there was a lack of consultation, and what it seemed that they were doing was deconstructing something that was meaningful. So I certainly think that's something that is played out quite well in Manchester, and Costas, I'm thinking particularly about the trees of hope. I am right in thinking that some of the flowers, some of the matter of the flowers was used for the compost. So it's changing its shape and it's being moved, but it's going into something that represents growth and nourishment and nurture. And I think that that is solace for the public. They can see that sense of growth enacted. And when people walk down St. Anne's Square, the spontaneous memorial isn't there anymore, but these trees are, and every year those trees get bigger, and it's that sense of growth that I think carries quite a lot of that solace and comfort for the community.
Yeah, thank you. Shara, do you want to also add a comment? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on consultation, as Robert brought up. Across the kind of national competitions and national projects that I've been looking at, consultation will minimize the problems. It might not solve them, but it can minimize the problems. Particularly, there are just issues doing this where you've got multiple different audiences for a physical piece of architecture. You've got the general public who are hurt in one way by what's happened and exposed to the horror of it in one way. And then you've got a very different constituency who are the families who are hurt in a very different way and need something perhaps that's not exactly the same as the broader public audience from the design. And so they both have to be integrated into this kind of consultation process, especially if the site itself cannot be accessed for a memorial. I'm thinking of Manchester actually here, that you can't use privately owned land inside an arena for a memorial that can communicate to both of those stakeholder groups. It's just not possible. So there has to be consultation about how to solve this issue and to try and involve people in this. That would probably come out of the comparative case study as it's not a perfect way through the set of issues that there are with how to do this, but it's certainly a good way to proceed, is to have as much consultation as possible, and to also balance artists and kind of civic authorities on the judging panel, because if one side dominates, it can lead to issues further down the line, and so a balance can help to smooth this through. Yeah.
Well, maybe also another question for all three of you. How synchronized are then, the meanings that are assigned to spontaneous memorials and the memorial projects that come later? Because if we have a different kind of audiences, in the immediate aftermath, we have a broad public, a group of strangers that goes and mourn in the street and expresses their feelings, emotions. that can range from being, I don't know, angry to being sad. And then, you know, like with the first anniversaries, with the museum projects, we have a different kind of audiences for that kind of memory. So how do we kind of like bridge this, you know, like meanings of spontaneous memorials and meanings we want to inscribe, you know, like for the long term, you know, in these kind of institutional projects, government-led initiatives, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's difficult because in Manchester, the spontaneous memorial items is seen as, you know, the people's monument, and the permanent monument is almost the state's monument, or perhaps to some extent the state's and the family's monument. And I find interesting the cases where there has been an effort to use some of the spontaneous memorial items into the permanent memorial. I think in Utoya, they try to do that, if I'm right, Charlotte, and in other cases as well. And I think this is one way to bridge the two.
Is it also to, as Charlotte also mentioned, a way to preserve this kind of authenticity, and not only to engage victims and victims' families into consultations, but also preserving this kind of authenticity of the site, like it was the case in Utoya. I think in cafeteria, that's the only place where they actually, that is authentic there.
So that is a part of the Norwegian case study that I couldn't bring up today, but is absolutely fascinating in terms of the distinction between which memorials for who. And the private memorial on Utoya is for the families and the relatives, and also, you know, those who might have been there or affected in a more direct way. That plan also had to be scrapped and remade completely. So originally, one of the buildings most dramatically and horrifically affected is the cafe building. And it was just in a bad state of repair before then anyway, and was not functional really for the kind of youth groups that they were holding of that size. So they really needed to remake the facilities on the island for other reasons that weren't to do with commemoration. And then the event happens. They also need to build a memorial on the island, which they do, which only the families or researchers with a permission can access. And they plan to tear down the cafe building because, number one, horrendous memories are associated with it. Number two, it's not functional. And they presented this, the island's caretakers presented this proposal to the families, and the families responded very well. One set of families said, if you do this, I will chain myself to the cafe building to stop you doing it. You will not destroy the last place that my child was. I will stop you. And so they had to take all this on board, thinking, okay, we've gone radically off track here. We cannot proceed. And they come up with the most beautiful kind of award-winning design compromise to preserve the site for the families who can visit at any time privately. And what they've done is they've built an enormous new structure around the cafe building. So the cafe building remains. The site, as the families need it, remains and can be visited. But around it is a whole new structure to encompass the kind of educational function that is also required for the new groups that visit. So they've basically used design in an incredible way to do both at once. But that took some doing, and that took revisiting the plan a lot to balance the educational function, the public function, and the private function for the families at once. It is very, very complicated to do.
Rob, do you want to add something? Because we are, I think, out of the time in this panel.
Yeah, very quickly then. One of the things that picks up on what you were saying before about the sense of bridging gaps between the different people that are involved in this. I think Manchester largely got it right again, I think, in the sense that what seemed to be apparent in Manchester is that they went for, I think it was essentially the cultural or geographical makeup of the place. So this was not an attack on individual people or individual groups. This was an attack on Manchester. And by giving it that kind of cultural and geographic dimension, it meant that they were able to tap into things that were already there, past cultural traumas. So I think the Costas, a woman in your video, mentioned the IRA bombings in the Arndale, Peterloo massacre. Also things like music as well. This was a music event that was attacked. So particularly the vigil that took place on the 25th of May was very much kind of music themed. There was an impromptu sing-song at one of the vigils. The Manchester Bee as well picks up onto kind of cultural identity of Manchester. And I think by doing that, what they do is they lift it away from individual groups and people and make it about a place and about a group of people that share commonality because of where they're from. And that's reflected in a lot of the messages. And I think particularly the good thing with that is that it makes it very much about place and identity than it does about individuals and beliefs. And I think the thing I found in a lot of the conversations I have with people, I don't think I've ever found a person that looks back at that time around the memorial with any kind of negative light. Everyone always, like it was a special event, or something like a celebration. And it's interesting how people remember it with such positive light. I think because it kind of tapped into so many cultural and geographic elements.
Well, that is interesting because in Brussels, as you probably know, we had an anomalous case with people actually protesting against the mourners and trampling the memorial. And then over time, we had also issues with people lamenting that spontaneous memorial just, it stinks, literally. So there were different kind of cases, but we have Sarah Gensburger, who also wanted to pitch in really, really briefly because we are out of time.
I will discuss some of this later in my presentation, but I just wanted to bring another case in this diversity of situations. As Kostas rightly said, all the cases are different, but like in Nice, after July 14, we have maybe an extreme case, which bridges with Charlotte's presentation, since the grassroots memorial itself include from the very beginning a negative part, like a place where people came and brought some trash, and really something very dirty, which it's a very peculiar case. And I just wanted to add this to the discussion and also put that in relation to the fact that precisely the city of Nice was in a very difficult position on how to curate all that, and especially because these grassroots memorials are not, even for those who come there, it's not always consortial, and it can be very aggressive and negative also. So I just wanted to bring this case into the whole panel and presentation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in this panel. And now we'll have a 10-minute break. So we will be back here at 11:15. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Sky boy and wonder, maybe there's a kingdom above the weather. Oh, and whether you're gonna get on in is up to him. If you ever hear that crying in the distance, like some siren, maybe there's a singer with no ring around their little finger, no love. And if I lose my voice, or if I have no choice if I die too young, of the wolf he comes, fee fi fo fum. And if I die too young, of the locust come, well then run, 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 free. Gunshot, you may think about what you do, but you don't got. Say a prayer, think of mother, I am a rock. If you ever hear that sound now, if the door gets kicked in here, they come now. Think of others, be their cover, I am what they're not. Pray for Paris, they cannot scare us or stop the music. You got a sweet voice, child, why don't you use it? And if I die too young, of the gunmen come, I'm full of love. So release me, every piece of me, up above. Love my sister, can't stand the coppers up in their choppers. Oh, flying overhead, 49 day. Singing, oh my Lord, come carry me home. Oh my Lord, come carry me home. I'm singing, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. And if I die too young for something I ain't done, carry my name every day. Oh, I'm sorry, oh, I'm sorry, Freddie Gray. But sleep easy, like baby Jesus in a manger. Oh, sleep easy, like little Jesus, beautiful stranger. Oh, beautiful stranger. Be remembered, and I'll sleep easy like baby Jesus in his manger. And I'll sleep easy like little Jesus, safe from danger. Carry onward like some songbird, beautiful stranger. Carry onward like some strong bird, beautiful stranger. Oh, beautiful stranger. crying in the distance, like some siren. Maybe there's a singer with no ring around their little finger, no love. And if I lose my voice, or if I have no choice but to go quiet, won't you sing for me a melody into the night air? And if I die too young, or if the wolf he comes, fee-fi-fo-fo. And if I die too young, or if the locust come, well then run, 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 free. Gunshot, you may think about what you do, but you don't got. Say a prayer, think of mother, I am a rock. If you ever hear that sound now, if the door gets kicked in here, they come now. Think of others, be their cover, I am what they're not. Pray for Paris, they cannot scare us or stop the music. You got a sweet voice, child, why don't you use it? If I die too young, or if the gunmen come, I'm full of love. So release me, every piece of me, up above. Love my sister, can't stand the coppers up in their choppers. Oh, flying overhead, 49 day. Singing, oh my Lord, come carry me home. Oh my Lord, come carry me home. I'm singing, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. And if I die too young for something I ain't done, carry my name every day. Oh, I'm sorry, oh, I'm sorry, Freddie Gray. But sleep easy, like baby Jesus in a manger. Oh, sleep easy, like little Jesus.
So hello, everybody, and welcome to the second part of our conversation on memorialization and terrorism. So in this second part of the conference of the event, we will try to connect not only spontaneous memorials and the institutional, more official forms of memorials that come usually after the first year, but we will also like to talk about memorial needs of the victims and the ways in which these victims' voices are being part of the broader narrative of the process of memorialization, of the process of commemoration. We also want to connect not only the local memorial practices, but we want to put them in a conversation with broader national projects and also the European dimension of the remembrance, because of course there is also a European dimension of the remembrance of the victims of terrorism. And in this panel, we will have three speakers that will talk about their own personal experiences, mainly, but also in their role as researchers, practitioners, drawing from a number of different cases. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sophia Dolan, who will talk about her personal experience of being one of the victims of the Brussels attacks in 2016. And this is the case that I'm most familiar with. And also, I know that Sophia is now doing a master thesis and doing a research paper on this topic. So I would like to ask her to share her experiences with us and also her presentation that she prepared on her preliminary results of her research that tries to kind of incorporate all these personal insights.
Okay, first I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. So good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for the invitation and the interesting remarks of the panelists. They just started working in my street, so I hope it won't interrupt me too much. So I am Sophia, and I was present myself at the Brussels attacks at the airport. That took place on the 22nd of March 2016. And at that time, I was on my way to Rome with my schoolmates for a school trip. And even though, fortunately, there have been no fatalities in our school group, I've noticed in my personal environment that ever since the attack, people have suffered from psychological consequences, and some of us even up until now. So I've already attended several commemorations at the Brussels airport, including this year's commemoration. And a number of things had struck me during this commemoration. So I went there with a friend who was also with me during the attack. And after a very formal commemoration and a minute of silence, our Belgian King Philip and our Prime Minister De Croo came to talk with us, as you can see on the picture. So for us, it was very unexpected and even a bit confronting, especially since journalists were recording our conversations and were coming very close to us. And on the one hand, it was, of course, an experience to have a talk with them. But on the other hand, it was also a pity because we were not prepared for this. And also I feel that the attention was mainly focused on them, on the King and the Prime Minister, and not on the events of 5 years ago. So partly because of this incident, it strikes me that everyone who is a victim or a survivor of a terroristic attack deals with the events in a very different way. Some people are happy to share their story with journalists and with the media, while others, including myself, are rather shy about it. Some schoolmates of mine who studied film directing, they used their experience to make a mini-series about our experiences and the aftermath of the attacks. Also, some people wrote down our experiences and shared it on Facebook the weeks after the attack. I also did that. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are victims or survivors who are rather reluctant to talk about the subject with journalists, but also with friends or family. And this wide variety of ways of dealing with what has happened, it fascinates me. And this is one of the reasons that I'm writing a paper on the subject for my master's degree in comparative international politics at the KU Leuven. So this paper is for the masterclass on European memory politics, which is also co-taught by Dr. Milosevic. So in this paper, I seek to examine how the voices of victims are used in European memory politics on the one hand, and what academic literature is available on the use of the narratives of victims of terrorism. And in my paper, there is special attention paid to the sharing of victim stories with the media. So the working group Voice of Victims of Terrorism, which is a part of the RAN, the Radicalization Awareness Network of the European Commission, worked on how testimonies from victims of terrorism can work as a powerful narrative in the fight against violent extremism. So for this paper, I consulted a lot of documents from this working group. And in addition of the analysis of the several documents and academic articles, I also wanted to do some interviews with some victims who've already been in contact with the media to ask them about their experiences with this media contact and the reasons why they wanted their voice to be heard in the media. And I've already contacted several victims and victim organizations, but I've only been able to reach and interview 2 victims. And I think the reason for this may be that it's a loaded topic for the victims. But at this point, it's a bit difficult for me to reach victims for my research paper. So at this point, I can make a few preliminary findings of the research paper. And the first is that in European memory politics, and then especially the Victims of Terrorism Working Group of the RAN, the emphasis is mainly on the use of victim stories in the context of de-radicalization and less on the personal reasons why a victim shares his or her story in a community or in the media. And the working group's documents also show that they believe in the effectiveness of using victim narratives as a de-radicalization technique, while some academic sources are rather skeptical about the effectiveness. And a last finding is that although both the study group and the academic literature emphasize victim assistance when victims are talking with the media, the interviews I already conducted show that this specific assistance from, for example, victim association organizations was not present when they shared their stories with the media. So I hope I have given you both a personal and academic insights on the topic now. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to engaging in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for your presentation. We move now directly to Maria. Maria Lozano Alia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Maria.
Perfectly well.
Yeah, who is a dear colleague, also from the Radicalization Awareness Network, where we have been sitting together for a number of years now. Maria, many more years than myself. Maria is someone who is quite important, let's say, influential voice in this discussion on the voices of victims. And I really look forward to your presentation, Maria. Just really quickly, I want to say a few words that Maria was one of the founders, and also the director of the Network of Association of Victims of Terrorism in Spain. And as I already mentioned, she is working really closely with the European Commission for many years on raising awareness on victims' voices, and especially in organizing the EU commemoration for the victims of terrorism in Spain, but also internationally, Europeanly. Maria, without further ado, please.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. First of all, congratulations for so interesting interventions for the event by itself, and thank you for having me. I will try now to share my screen. Not sure if I'm allowed.
Yes, you are allowed. You can go on the green button, share screen.
Okay. Yeah. I will. Let me please. Well, it seems I'm having some problem, but I think that I can go ahead without the presentation, okay?
As you prefer.
So no problem. Yeah. I think it would be better. I'm not very good with this sort of technical, at least with this Zoom. I'm always with Teams. So in any case, sorry for this inconvenience, but I think it would be even better because after listening to Sophia, I will probably change some points of my presentation. I was thinking about having a brief overview of what is the legal framework, what is the political response of the European Union to the current situation of these European societies and their government facing with the rise of terrorist attacks, with the rise of violent extremism, and how the rise of this international terrorism has overshadowed the recent past in Europe, the recent past linked to domestic terrorism in Europe. And although there has been a change in the modus operandi of this international terrorism, jihadist terrorism, which are increasingly linked to individuals or small groups of radicalized people who try to do the greatest possible damage among the population, and how this modus operandi has affected European societies, but also their response as a society, looking for the best way to create this public memory. We can speak, I'm sure, well, we have spoken before about the attacks in London, in Manchester, in Barcelona, but even when this is the problem that we are facing now in Europe, we shouldn't forget the tremendous damage caused by those domestic terrorist movements that emerged during the past century in Europe, namely in Northern Ireland, in Italy, or in the Basque Country, that left behind thousands of fatalities and an even greater a number of injured people. But what is even more important, and I think here is the real link with the thing that we are speaking today, it's with the communities and societies broken by this violence. So this social reach, moreover, is not only caused by terrorist actors and actions, but it's also increased by the action, and this is important, the action of these extremist narratives, in this case, launched and supported by national, in most of cases, far extremist ideologies, right? That sow hatred towards certain sectors of the population, creating this link, blaming them for the attacks, for the terrorist attacks, simply because of their religion or simply because of their geographic origin. So proof of this is the growing level of Islamophobia or anti-immigrants movements linked to far-right ideology, as I mentioned before, which takes terrorist attacks as real proof of this own hate narrative, penetrating society, polarizing it, and dividing the communities. And it is here when the role of policies of public memory and institutional recognition of the damage and pain generated in the victims and in the population becomes a very important tool to confront this social breakdown and polarization caused by this terrorist violence. So the interpretation of what and why happened is condensed in public memory policies. And linked to the introduction that you did, Anna, and on the other hand, taking into account the victimization processes and the needs that arise during this process, the immediate response, all of us know that it involves medical, psychological, or other measures aimed at repairing the victim situation in the very short term. But in the same way, there are real needs of memory and recognition by society, and appears in the medium and in the long term. So the response of governments to assist, to support victims, there's no doubt that has had more time to be designed and implemented and even, let's say, evaluated in those areas that had to face domestic terrorism for several years, as for example, it's the case of Spain. But we need to realize that the victimization process is constructed and completed also through these acts of public memory, emphasizing the damage produced and increasing the perception of justice for the victims. Victims need to feel that there's justice for them, and these public memories recognizing the damage caused to them and the support that society and the governments can provide to them is there for them. This is the sense, the perception of justice. This perception that is sometimes not obtained when this process, the victimization process is exclusively linked to the criminal process, because I'm sure that all of us now that the relevance, the role that in most of member states victims of terrorism have within the criminal process is not the most adequate. And in most of cases, this role within the criminal process can even create a sort of secondary victimization for the victim. So it's very important that we realize that government, and in this case even, we will speak about this later, the European institutions recognize that they need to create a sort of public response to meet these needs of memory, of recognition from victims of terrorism. So the proposals of the governments and local authorities in relation to the policies of public memory must therefore respond to two real needs that are a consequence of the terrorist violence. First of all, the real needs of victims, but also those needs derived from this social breach and derived from this polarization that the terrorist acts are causing in our society. So the way in which this public memory is promoted and stimulated by the states is also linked to the idiosyncrasies of the style, if we want to use this not very academic term, but according to the expectations of the and national societies, the real target of these public memories. And also wanted to bring some reflections about the concept of public memory in Europe. I'm sure that all of us, we can agree that memory is intangible and is linked to the perception of each individual. So therefore, the emotional intelligence of our recipients is key, it's very important, and will be an essential factor in the construction of this individual, but also collective memory. So these memories, these policies of public memory should be linked, and it is very important, and probably it's one of the main conclusions of my work within not only the network of associations of victims of terrorism, but the radicalization awareness network too. If we want these public policies, these public memory policies to be efficient, they need to be linked to education. This is important. Even when the previous speaker was speaking about the possible role of the voices of victims of terrorism linked to de-radicalization, I would like to highlight here that, and I'm now changing a little bit, but I really didn't want to forget about this. I wouldn't say that, of course, they haven't been evaluated in most of cases, but I wouldn't say that the main goal of victims who want to be involved in this sort of PD campaigns, preventing violent extremism campaigns, and not sometimes linked to public memories too, are targeting radicalized individuals. But I would say that most of their testimonies are focused on preventive campaigns. I mean, mainly aimed at raising awareness about the real effects of a terrorist attack, but in not so many cases linked to the de-radicalization processes that all of us know that it's sometimes it's a sort of one-to-one intervention. Lots of victims, probably in France, and some of them are involved in this sort of initiatives, but it's not the general case. I think that in most cases, in Europe at least, and in South Asia and South Asia too, are more linked to preventive campaigns. So going ahead with my presentation, I'm sorry because I know I realize that I'm jumping in with new ideas, but I really wanted to share with them. According to our research, analyzing which were the public memories, so the responses from public institutions, but also from private organizations and from society in general. And very briefly, because I'm sure that you will know about it, we have identified a sort of typology. We can identify institutional responses from national, regional, or local authorities as specific national and international legislation. This is very, very important. And I think that those member states with a past very linked to domestic terrorism, and it's the case of Spain or Italy, with a different approach, but in the case of UK and Northern Ireland, they have their own national legislation focused or aimed at supporting victims of terrorism. And in some of these legislation, specifically in the Italian and the Spanish one, there are some articles of these legal tools focused on fostering this public recognition and this public memory for victims of terrorism. One of the different institutional responses is the creation of these days of remembrance. Again, those member states with a past linked to domestic violence are the ones who have more experience and are step forward. Other member states, again, that's the case of, in this case, Northern Ireland too, and the UK, but Italy and Spain, and more recently France too. Manifests, it's a different sort of institutional response. These are national or regional or institutional declarations on the occasion of the commission of an attack, and which aim to acknowledge the loss and suffering of the victims and the solidarity of the public institutions and the society with them. We also know that there are lots of physical monuments financed with public funding by national, regional, or even local authorities. In any case, and I think we'll go in line with some of the previous speakers, and specifically linked to all the troubles that the Oslo Society had to suffer when selecting, when picking up the place to build this memorial. The location is so important. The location and the involvement of victims when identifying which is the most adequate place to build these physical monuments, because this geographical location can also have a political and social significance, a political and social meaning. And this is important for the victims, and this is very important for the society. Even if we want these public memories to have a role in terms of bridging communities, of healing communities. So, as I mentioned before, the involvement of victims in the design of these memorials is key, is very important, and authorities in charge of organizing these memorials should realize this. Also, according to this typology, institutional responses, memorial centers, museums, or civic centers. On the other hand, and coming from private initiatives, all of us know several private monuments with a similar typology as the one I mentioned related to the institutional responses. But something that I wanted to speak about, and it has been mentioned several times during the first panel, is the memorials and acts of spontaneous recognition, but not only physically with these candles, flowers, or stuffed animals, but also online. I think this is very important. This is public memory too. And this is the way that our societies are identifying and are choosing to demonstrate their support with victims. And it's also, in some occasions, the way that victims are looking for that support. So probably, and I considering the high level of this panel, I would invite some of you, of the people from academia, to start researching on this, because it's something important, and I think it's something that could offer us some room for collaboration between victims organizations, and also public institutions, local, national governments, and private initiatives too. I would also like to very briefly to bring today, which is the legal framework from the European Union. As Anna mentioned before, the European Union selected March 11th as the European Day of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism. It was suggested by the European Parliament, and it has been celebrated, I think that for the last, help me Anna if I'm not correct, but probably for the last 10 years, it was celebrated in Brussels. Previously, it was celebrated also, thank you, it was celebrated also in Madrid, and more recently, it was celebrated in Paris, and this last year in Madrid too. And this is sort of sad, because this was, and this is my personal opinion, I want to be clear, I'm not anymore the working group leader of the Radicalization Awareness Network, the Victims of Terrorism Working Group. I've been there for the last 5 years, but I'm not, so I want to say this because this is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking about any other institution, nor UN, nothing, right? And what I was trying to say that this is sad. I mean, Europe probably has been one of the most, regions more affected, with a lot of suffering, with a lot of pain, and with communities really broken by these terrorist acts. And it's sad that the unique response from the European Union is the creation of European Day. Because if we have a look at which is the probable legal framework, we can speak about the framework decision to combat certain forms of expression of racism and xenophobia through criminal legislation. So this seems, and this is the only article that could have a link to what we are speaking today in terms of creating public memories, is that each member state shall adopt the necessary measures to ensure that the following intentional conduct is punished. And they mention public apology, denial of Atlantic trivialization of crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes as defined in Articles 6, 7, and 8 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court, directed against a group of persons or a member of such a group defined in relation to race, color, religion, ancestry, or national or ethnic origin. I mean, there's a very brief legislation trying to avoid any sort of memorialization of the perpetrators. But even having a look at the more recent legal tools related to victims of terrorism and counterterrorism, and it's the Directive 2012/29, which establishes the minimum standards to support victims of crime, or the Anti-Terrorism Directive from the 2017/541. There's no mention made in any of them to the obligation of member states to implement any policy of public memory in relation to victims of terrorism. So even when this memorialization through the European Day of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism, it's of course a good initiative, but it's not enough. It's not enough, mainly if we think about the big effort that national governments, public institutions are asking victims of terrorism in Europe to speak up, to collaborate in programs that prevent violent extremism. Of course, it's not compulsory, but they are inviting victims. In most of cases, as the previous speaker, Sophia, mentioned before, without the proper support. And it's very important that we realize that we cannot, let's say, foster the involvement of victims of terrorism in any sort of public campaign linked to PVE or public memories if we are not ensuring that any sort of secondary victimization will be avoided, and we can avoid that supporting victims who want to help us. So this is important. This is something that the European Union is missing now. So very briefly, in trying now to finish, I wanted to bring some conclusion, and indeed it's the result of our work. And after analyzing which have been the initiatives in different regions in Europe. The first of them is the involvement of civil society and the communities affected by terrorist violence, and fundamentally the victims must be ensured. Since the very first moment when the community and the victims are identifying which will be the most adequate form to recognize the damage. We need to involve victims, we need to involve the communities. And these public memories, again, should have a link to educational, to an educational goal. Public memories are really good, but if we are now, all of us, so focused on preventing further damage, why not try to use these public memories as a tool to prevent violent extremism with this educational goal? And it's also necessary to strengthen the memory policy from the European institutions, as I mentioned before. A European Day of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism is not enough. I think that today is not the most adequate day to speak about the pros and cons of this day. Anna and me, we have shared our thoughts about this day several times. And finally, last but not least, because this is really important, the political use of public memories policies and their use as a prevailing narrative on the historical events themselves should be avoided at all times. So this type of policies originates division in societies when they are adopted using some political goal based on the identity prioritization of these memorials, which results more often into polarize more again the society. And probably this is linked with the case that some of you were mentioning before, when we are now confronting even some demonstrations against the memorialization, against the recognition to victims of terrorism. Maybe it's because this previous memorialization was not well defined and was not well prioritized with the ultimate goal of reaching the communities. So I think I'm done. Sorry again, because I couldn't manage to use my presentation. And again, thank you very much for having me, and I will be more than happy to discuss any other point. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for very interesting points that you have raised in your presentation. Sarah was just sending a message in chat whether we should skip her presentation. Of course not, Sarah. We were looking forward to your presentation. I'm gonna give you like 10 minutes of my time so that we can hear your presentation as well, because it's, I think, quite important to talk about the Paris case. So the last speaker in today's panel, in today's event, is Sarah Gainsbourg, who is a social scientist at the French National Center for Scientific Research and also author of numerous books, and especially on the topic of terrorism. One of these books is Memory on My Doorstep, Chronicles of a Neighborhood, that is actually addressing Sarah's own personal and academic experience of researching terrorism and societal responses to terrorism in Paris. That was published in 2019, and also most recently an edited volume with Jérôme Truc on memorials of the 13th November. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to try to be quick. And thank you so much, Sofia and Maria, for all this insight. I will very much like to discuss it further, especially because I've been studying also the social appropriation of memory policies for some time. And so many important topics in what you presented in your talk, Maria. So how to be quick? First, Anna just said that, but I want to make sure that for you that I'm speaking as a researcher and also an inhabitant of the 11th arrondissement, since I live midway between Place de la République and the Bataclan. And so I'm not speaking on behalf of the victims here, but more as someone who has been working on this issue as a specialist of memory studies and as someone who's been living close to the events. And because of this mixed position, I've been having a lot of discussion with the victims groups since the very beginning. And actually they called me at some point to help them to get along with each other, and I'm going to come back to that, in terms of how to memorialize what they wanted to keep as something important for them in relation to the event. So this is the two books Anna just referred to, and you can have a look if you want more details, but I'm going to go to the most important things right now. So I tried to start with the questions that Anna actually wrote for today's panel. So whose memory? In asking that, I will say that from the very beginning, from the grassroots memorial, indeed, so here you see Place de la République, we could see several tensions around this issue of whose memory. And I could develop like maybe 10 of them, but I won't. And I want to focus on three main ones. So the first tension behind this question of whose memory will be between private mourning, private memory, and public commemorations. So what will this memorialization be about? Is it about learning political lessons from the past, from the event, or remembering the victims? And Maria just addressed that. What is the challenge in order to articulate these two directions? Can the two really come along or not? The second tensions will be between local, national, and international scales of memorialization. Paris being at the same time, of course, one of the French cities, so a local place, but also the capital of a very centralized country, which France is, and the most visited and maybe one of the most iconic cities in the world. Finally, when does November 13 took place, it was considered from the very beginning as part of historical memory. And it came after Charlie Hebdo, January 2015, and before Nice, July 14, 2016, and was including in a long-term history of terrorism in France. So where the event actually really started and when did it end? How November 13 is an event in itself, and so how do we memorialize it in this long-term history? Actually, these three main tensions were displayed as early as in the grassroots memorials. So here you see some of the pictures of the victims put in front of the Bataclan. So there are victims either of the Bataclan or the terraces, no difference there. And they were put by people who did not have any personal links to the victims. And we have hundreds of such pictures. So this is an example of this very difficult tension between private and public memorialization of the victims themselves. Second example, always at the grassroots memorials. So you see these three scales of local, national, international at the grassroots memorials themselves. So here is the Paris scales. Here is the national one, so with either in words or with the flags, of course. And here is the international one. We had a lot of messages written in foreign languages or written on behalf of foreign groups, whether tourists or immigrants. And of course, a lot of foreign flags also on displays. But this internationalization of the immediate memorialization also took place through the references to other terrorist attacks. So this is at the crossing of the issue of geographic scale and historical scales. Finally, what November 13 stands for. Does it stand for itself as a proper event only, or as a symbol of terrorism worldwide? So on purpose, I put here, for example, some of them being in the Western world and another one being in Africa. So you have Ouagadougou, it's one of the terrorist attacks which took place after November 13. On the left, Ankara and Brussels and Orlando. But this, actually, this historical generalization of November 13 also took place at the very scale of France, since on the sites of the grassroots memorials, which came after the Bataclan and the Terrasse, you had a lot of references to January attacks. So I put two examples of Je suis Charlie, or later about Nice, which was commemorated on the grassroots memorials of November 13 as early as July 15. Actually, these three tensions I've been pointed at did not disappear since, and are at the very core of all the process of permanent memorialization, which took place since the immediate aftermath of the attack. So briefly, I will give you some examples. So here you have actually the first permanent memorial of November 13, which is very peculiar. So it's a memory oak and a plaque. So the plaque says, for those who don't speak French, in memory of the victims of the terrorist attacks in January and November 2015 in Paris, Montrouge and Saint-Denis, the French people pay homage to them here. So here, the commemoration, the permanent commemoration, is for the victims. And this is very peculiar because it's maybe the most quick permanent memorialization, because it was inaugurated as early as January 2016. Of course, you understand why, because before November 13, the project of the city of Paris was to have a special forest planted on Place de la République with 17 trees, in reference to the 17 people killed in January 2015. But after November 13, this project couldn't happen anymore. It would have been impossible to plant a forest of almost 150 trees on Place de la République. So the commemoration of November 2015 became a larger commemoration, and that's why we have this first permanent memorial. So here is the issue of the November 13 being commemorated as part of a larger history. Now this tree has been replaced because the first one died and is not at all appropriated, neither by the victims group, neither by the state, neither by the Parisians or tourists. No one care and no one even know about this place. The second level of permanent commemoration are the plaques. So this is regular and classic forms of commemoration and permanent memorials in the city of Paris. We have thousands of them, and you know that if you've been to Paris. So very logically, it was the format used by the city of Paris after November 13, and for the first year commemoration, all the sites where the attack took place, so the terraces and the Bataclan, had a plaque put with the names of the people killed. So the victims here are the one who got killed, not the survivors. It's a very important point, and we are going to come back to that later. But here again, you have a very important tension at stake between the victims and the sites where the killing took place and the rest of society, since very significantly, none of these plaques actually are put on the very building where the events took place. This is not normal. In Paris, normally, all these kind of plaques are on the wall of the buildings where the event took place. But here you had a real tension between the request of visibility supported by the victims and the request of invisibility supported, among others, by the owners of the places where the events took place, mainly the owners of the Bataclan or the owners of the restaurants and cafes. So everyone agreed around the fact of having a form of memorialization, but not on your place, because you wanted also business to come back to as usual. And here, the evolution of this plague through times was the result of the victims groups' insistence to have something more proper and more visible, more solemn than it was at the beginning. Here, so the only place where you actually have something on the wall of the site is the Bataclan. And you see here, so when you don't speak French, you can compare the two plaques. The first one is in memory of the victims killed and hurt here in November 13, 2015. And following the victims' insistence to really signify the visitors and the passers-by that on the square in front of the Bataclan, you have the proper plaque, the one with the list of the victims. They added 2 years after, they obtained by the city hall to add that a stele, an actual plaque with the names, can be seen in the square in front of the building. So the next step was, so this plaque were made in relation with the victims group, but not for the victims group. They were meant to signify all society that something actually took place there. The next step was the decision of the city hall to work jointly with the victims group to build proper memorials for their dead. So here I won't have the time to develop that, but in details. But the two things very important. So in the Paris case, you have two victims groups, two victim representative association. The first one will be Life for Paris, and I'm very, very much doing it roughly, so there are nuances, but please be tolerant. You have first group Life for Paris, who is made mainly, not only, but mainly of survivors. So mostly young people who survived the killing. Some of them were at the Bataclan or the terraces, but the survivor dimension is very important. The other one is made of older people, mostly fathers and mothers of the dead. And so these two associations at the beginning, they had different and separate forms of commemoration. So here I love this picture. It's something that took place. So you have as many balloons as the number of victims, and it's the association commemoration made by Love for Paris. So the victims, they needed two different things from these memorials that the city of Paris wanted to build. They needed, some of them needed mourning because they had lost people, and others wanted the memorials to speak of surviving. Anyway, because we don't have time, the final decision. So they had a very long process. That's why they contacted me to help them to get along better on this project. And after the memory, the city of Paris created working groups and workshops to accompany them to build what they really wanted together. And so finally, this is olive oil that was presented in the 2019 commemoration in Paris, and it will be planted on a garden of memory in the 4th arrondissement very soon. As a conclusion, I would just evoke the museum project that is going to take place on President Macron's decision. And here, so it's still an ongoing project, but in the way this memorial museum, so it will be a memorial and a museum, is built, really bring again in the discussion all the tensions and the balances I pointed at. And it started with November 13, but in almost all the discussions, the team who is in charge of the museum always says, we are not going to please remember that we are not going to do a museum and a memorial on November 30 or even on the year 2015, but something which is called a Memorial Museum of Societies Facing Terrorism. And actually the events which will be addressed in this museum, it was decided that it will be all the terrorist attack in France or against French citizens since 1964. And it will also bring some comparisons with foreign cases. And first, they considered having this museum in Paris, but finally the museum will be in Suresnes, which is in the Paris region. We can discuss that in the global discussion if you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for this interesting presentation. I was really looking forward to hearing about the Paris case, because I know it's so nuanced and that you're quite involved. I would like to take 10 minutes more of your time to have a short discussion on these three presentations that are quite similar and quite different, because I tend to agree with Sarah that, when we talk about memorialization of the victims of the attacks, it is a quite complex picture that is often a lot about contestation, whether from the victims associations, whether about when we talk about political appropriation of memorials and commemorative days on national or even European level, as Maria said. Charlotte has a question. Yes.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. My question is to Sarah about the societal museum, which brings together all different attacks and represents them together. I've looked at the one that's planned for Vitoria in Spain. So I have a real interest in museums that do this. So I wondered if you could just say more about how the presentation of events from, I'm guessing, very different eras of history, very different types of conflict is planned, and also if there's any relevance to the location where the museum will be. Is it why that location? Why has it been chosen? Thank you.
Okay, so the museum is framed as being a society museum, not a history museum or, of course, an art museum, but something more of ethnographic museum. So it's how it's framed and presented by its promoters. So the idea is really to have a museum about the way societies react to terrorism, which is a challenge. And also the very difficult thing with this museum is that actually the head of the museum is Henri Rousseau, who is very famous in France for being a specialist of memory policies of the Vichy regime, of the history of Vichy and how France dealt with this Second World War past. So he says himself that he's in French we will say franchir le Rubicon. So he went the other side of the thing. Before he studied public policies, and now is part of building it. So what he wants to do in this project is also to build a place where you can be informed on how memory works, actually. So the project is in a way a second degree project, but of course there is a lot of challenges and conflicts, especially around the dates. So at the beginning, the date of the museum, but also of the medal for being a victim of terrorism was supposed to start in 2006. But because of the pressure of several victims associations, rightly, I think, they decided to move it up to 1964. But of course, one of the stakes was not to include the Algerian war. So I can speak very long about that, but we can have this discussion after if you want. As a second point about location, so there is a very practical issue there. First, it was decided that it had to be in the Parisian region because it's the capital. And you have so many terrorist attacks since 1964 in France, everywhere. I mean, France is one of the countries where you had the most because in Western Europe, because of variety of causes. And so it had to be in the Parisian region. First, the city of Paris said she was going to find a place. But right now we are in a presidential election here, so the city of Paris and the state are not really good friends. So the state found a place in Suresnes. I think really practically it's because they found a place which is empty, but now they are building a discourse of the fact that this place is very relevant for two reasons. The first one is it's almost wall by wall with the Mont Valérien, which is a very important place in national memory in France. It's where the resistance were shot by the Germans during the war. And you have an official national memorial here inaugurated by General de Gaulle. And the second reason is the place used to be a place for the education of disabled young people. And it has a lot of gardens. It's very bright. So they said it's a very symbolic place because it's a place of resilience. So it's for you. Yeah.
Okay. I also have a question for everybody, actually, for all speakers, because I know that all of you have worked with victims and victims association to a certain degree. To what extent do you think that memorialization practices, especially for the victims of terrorism, are being politically used or appropriated in order to kind of mimic some sort of different needs that the victims voiced at the beginning? So let me rephrase that. To what extent do you think that official memorial policies can serve as some kind of band-aid for the actual needs of victims of terrorism, especially in the aftermath of the events?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I might jump in, okay.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I would say that, I mean, it's very, very sensitive, okay? According to the previous research and day-to-day that when we need to face with victims' needs, I mean, memorialization and recognition is a real need for victims of terrorism, that's for sure. That comes not in the immediate aftermath, nor short-term, but medium-term and long-term. That's for sure. Now, the involvement of victims association, it can be very helpful, but it can be very sensitive. And in some occasions, the involvement in this sort of victims of organization can be, let's put it in this way, not so supportive in terms of identifying a neutral memorialization for victims that really meets their recognition needs. Because in most of countries, in most of member states where there's a huge, let's say, lobby action from these victims association, in some occasions, there's also a link between these associations and some political movements. So it can bring a sort of political misuse of these public memories, which as a result brings that this memorialization is in no way meeting the real needs of victims. I'm trying to be polite, okay?
Yeah, because this is, I think, the essence of the, like what has emerged from this discussion, that there is some kind of contestation, there is some kind of disagreement on national level between the associations, between the victims, between the states as well, the member states, if we talk about European level. So what I'm really interested in is, how this gap could be actually bridged. Because if we think about the European commemoration and we think about European dimension of the remembrance and having this unified kind of approach, one could also say that, having this kind of non-national approach to the remembrance could actually benefit the whole process. But what we are actually seeing on the ground, that the nation states are actually rejecting this kind of European dimension of remembrance on the ground. And we have seen this with the EU commemoration of the victims of terrorism for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
That process has been hijacked both by the France and Spain.
Exactly.
If I can jump in about the question, in the case of France, and especially of Paris attacks, I will say that the victims are quite supportive of this process of memorialization, and they are very much in favor of the museum, for example. They are part of the committee, especially because the museum is also going to be a memorial, so you will have 2 dimensions, and but it doesn't mean that at the same time, they are very, very critical with the politic of reparations in France. And right now we are going to have the trial in September, about November 13. And it's the occasion for the victims, in a large diversity of them, and I know them very personally, to contest the process of financial reparation, indemnizations, and so forth. So I will not say that the French state is buying some tranquility from the victims with the memorialization project, because the victims, individuals and associations are smarter than that, and they also try to see what they can win and gain from the different spheres and arenas, and they are very much into making some differences of the stakes in the different arena. And it doesn't mean that because they are participating actively in the Memorial Museum project, they will not voice and contest the way the state is giving them reparations, financial reparations, and also not only with money, but with diversity of resources to help them to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's quite important. And also what Costas and Robert were actually saying about spontaneous memorials, I think it's quite telling of the fact that, there is this stark difference of how memorialization is used over time and how it evolves actually from spontaneous to this kind of permanent memorials that we can have, or museums or memorial projects. Where on the one hand, of course, we have acceptance of, memorialization initiatives, and on the other side, we have rejection of memorialization initiatives, as also Sarah said, but also Charlotte also spoke about different ways of contesting memorial initiatives and different reasons for contesting memorial initiatives. And some of the commemorations as well are also being rejected or let's say, not used by the different kind of stakeholders, whether they are states, victims associations, or victims themselves. So for instance, maybe I can just mention the memorial that exists in Brussels for all the victims of all terrorist attacks. That's a neutral location, actually. And it was made after the Brussels attacks. That memorial is completely left to itself, because it is not a memorial that is attended, that is not a memorial that actually has some kind of audience, and it failed to kind of resonate with the victims groups, which is also, I think, a failure of the policy-making process around memorialization. If there are no other questions, I think that we can also close today's topic, at least in this Zoom event, because there are so many interesting topics that we have touched upon, and so many interesting things that we can discuss regarding the victims of terrorism and regarding memorialization policies. I want to remind you that the recording of this meeting can be found on the website of the European Observatory on Memories. There is also going to be a special kind of a tab with all the updates on the project we are currently working on. So I thank you so much for being part of this conversation, and I hope that we can discuss further on, maybe in some sort of a live meeting soon, and of course in our future works on the topic. So thanks again. Thank you very much for being part of this event.
Thank you for having us.